today. We've had a few moving pieces. As you know, our original plan was to have Ambassador Greer of Trade here today, but he was called over the weekend to move to London with Secretary of Treasury and Secretary of Commerce, and is involved in the negotiations with the Chinese with regard to issues on trade. So I think that's a pretty fair reason to be able to duck, and we appreciate him letting us know. We will reschedule for sure, and he'll have even more interesting things to tell us, I'm sure, after his time in London. But I think that flexibility and fast moving is the way our team works, and so we were able to organize another special event today to have Senator Dave McCormick speak to us. And so we're excited about that. David was born in Washington, Pennsylvania. He graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point and went on to serve as a paratrooper in the 82nd Airborne Division. He deployed to the Middle East during the first Gulf War and retired from the Army with the rank of captain. After his military service, David earned a PhD in international relations from Princeton University. He then moved to Pittsburgh, where he began a business career and became CEO of Free Markets, a technology company that employed hundreds of people in Western Pennsylvania. David returned to public service in the Bush administration, and he worked as Undersecretary of Treasury for International Affairs, and I was lucky enough to be his colleague at the Treasury Department at that same time. Also, he worked as Deputy National Security Advisor. He worked on technology policy, national security, and also the global response to the '08 crisis. David later joined Bridgewater, where he served as CEO, and he stepped down to run for the Senate. He was elected in 2024. David spent the morning on the runway in Washington on his way to be here with us in person, but unfortunately the weather didn't cooperate, so he's with us on Zoom. And though it's a bit odd and different, it seems to have worked out pretty well. I think another treat for me is to introduce our colleague and good friend, David Westin. David Westin is a fantastic journalist and another distinguished businessman. I'm also lucky enough to call him my friend, and he's the moderator and the anchor of Bloomberg Wall Street Week. So today's conversation is on the record. David will engage in a good conversation. We'll finish promptly at 1 o'clock. So thank you, David McCormack, for being here. Thank you, David Westin, for spending the time with us today, too. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, Bob. And Senator, thank you so much for this. Thank you for your patience on the tarmac. You have my complete sympathy. I think you had a few things you wanted to say at the outset. Did you not?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you, Bob Steele, for the invitation. And you know, Bob's a dear friend and has been a great supporter and mentor. And you know, no one's done more for New York than Bob Steele, and he's just an incredible friend and leader. And same with David Westin, a good pal who we've done this a couple times before. So David, thanks for doing it. Really honored to be with this important group this morning, or I guess this afternoon. And I really do apologize for not being there. It was quite a rough morning where most of the flights out of DCA got canceled. But the reason when Bob called me and asked me whether I wanted to do this, the reason I jumped at the opportunity is because I think it's such a dynamic moment in our economy, a dynamic moment in our country, that I wanted to share a perspective on it from someone who has sat in this room as a member of the audience, someone who traveled in these circles as the CEO of Bridgewater and the Undersecretary of Treasury, but also someone who just spent the last couple years campaigning, losing a very close race in Pennsylvania in 2022. I lost a primary by 900 votes. And then subsequently winning the Senate seat in 2024 by 15,000 votes. And the reason I wanted to start with that is as we get into the economic policies and the economic outlook, I think you have to understand the political situation and at least what I saw on the ground in Pennsylvania, because I think Pennsylvania is representative of the country in many ways. It's a purple state with big urban areas that are primarily Democratic, rural areas that are primarily Republican, but very interesting cross currents. And in my campaign in 2024, I made 500 stops. These are manufacturing facilities, VFWs, farms, fracking sites. And I got a perspective that really shaped my view of things. And in a nutshell, to put Pennsylvania in perspective, it's the sixth largest economy. It's the fifth largest population. The number one industry is agriculture. But if you looked across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania economically, the median income would be $52,000 a year. And there'd be 60% of the people in Pennsylvania that live paycheck to paycheck. And essentially, those people, for the most part, have not had a great last 20 years or so. For them, the last 20 years has meant that prices have gone up greater than wages. The challenges of globalization and trade have gutted many of those rural communities in particular. I grew up in a town that had a carpet mill. When I was in high school, there were 2,000 workers at the McGee carpet plant, and now there's about 200. These are the folks that disproportionately felt the impact of 20 years of war. They sent their kids, they came back banged up with PTSD or not at all. That wasn't largely places like New York City or Washington, D.C. And they've also felt the impact of illegal immigration in profound ways. In Pennsylvania, the fentanyl crisis, which has been a national crisis, killed 4,000 people last year in Pennsylvania alone. It killed 100,000 people nationally. And that 100,000, just to put that in perspective for you that in the audience that are probably my age or older, we lost 50,000 people in Vietnam in 8 years. We lost 100,000 people in the United States from fentanyl. The reason I set that context is that the people that I met on the campaign trail were voting for change. They wanted change. They wanted an economy that worked for them, that worked for working families. They wanted trade policies that they felt were fair. They wanted a border that was secure and didn't sacrifice their families. And that's the agenda that I largely ran on, which was to help working families build opportunity, fair trade, not free trade. I was someone who negotiated with China 20 years ago for free trade deals, and I'm now one who believes that we need to be focused on reciprocity and fairness. We can talk more about that. People that wanted the border closed, wanted law and order, and essentially wanted their fair shake. And so if we talk about the big beautiful bill, we talk about the border policies, we talk about trade, we talk about immigration. The framing of the policies starts, I think, with those experiences in Pennsylvania. And I'm about 150, 160 days into the job, so I'm still figuring it out. But I would say I'm very, very privileged to be able to do it. I'm the 54th elected senator from Pennsylvania, but I think I have a unique perspective because I now have learned what's going on the ground in a way that I had grown away from since I left for West Point. And I also, as I said, I have some perspective as someone who sat in this room with all of you. So I'm delighted to have a chance to share that today. Honored to be here. And David, why don't I turn to you and you can take it away.
Okay, Senator, thank you so much. That was very helpful to set up. So let's pick up on exactly what you talked about and what you learned from traveling all around Pennsylvania for the working men and women, if I can put it that way, and particularly people who are not having an easy time of it. What makes this bill beautiful? It's big. There's no question it's big, but what makes it beautiful for them?
Yeah, well, I think the starting point for this, and it's in some ways very advantageous to the people in this room and to them, is that if we don't pass the bill, we have the largest tax increase in history. And so, there's lots of media around this, but essentially, if you look at the bill, if you're a family that makes $50,000 a year, if we don't pass this bill, your taxes go up by $2,000 a year, $2,500. So it affects everybody. The large majority of the tax benefit for individual rates, 60% of it goes to people that make $400,000 or below, despite the fact that 80% of the taxes are paid by the people that make 10% or at the highest end of the 10%. But in addition to that, it's very pro-growth. It's pro the extension of the 2017 tax cuts, making permanent the expensing of capital and R&D, all of you in the room know that that's a stimulant to growth, and a growing economy is good for everybody. So those are the pro-growth policies that are in the tax bill. But in addition to that, and we could debate how pro-growth they are, but certainly President Trump campaigned on 3 additional things, which was tax on tips, tax on overtime, and tax on Social Security. And those benefits accrue particularly to the kind of folks that I was referring to, folks at the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder, and are advantageous to them. And so the bill includes both of those. In addition, the bill includes a plussing up on the border to stop the flow of illegal immigrants and fentanyl into the country. It plusses up the Border Patrol. It gives additional funding for technology on the border, and it plusses up defense, a pretty significant increase in defense of about $150 billion. For my state, that's a big deal, not only because we're going to make ourselves more secure with next generation technology, but I think Pennsylvania, which has a shipyard and a big defense industrial base in Pennsylvania, will be the beneficiary of that reindustrialization. So that's the picture of the pluses. And my only critique of the bill at this point, or my primary one, is that it starts to make significant steps towards bending the curve on our budget and reducing costs, but it probably doesn't do enough. And we can talk about that further. But I am worried about the $37 trillion of debt. I am worried about the $2 trillion annual deficit we have. I am worried about the $1 trillion interest payment. And we need to show an ability to begin to bend the curve on that. You can't address that problem without pro-growth economic policies that grow the economy, but you also have to show some fiscal discipline. This is a step in that direction. I hope in the Senate version we can do a little bit more.
Senator, we've heard from various people, including you, that if we don't extend those tax cuts from 2017, it's a tax increase. The only reason why that's true is because we were more or less promised in 2017 that the limit to them. And by the way, this is not unique to Republicans. Democrats have done this as well. Back when you were running Bridgewater, if you were looking at somebody who was doing this, keeping promising things down the road that never came to be, you would not look well at it. When I was budgeting for ABC, I'd get called on the carpet by the CFO. Isn't this really sort of misleading ourselves about our fiscal situation by having, and it's included in the one big beautiful bill too. I mean, if you really if you make permanent what's going on there, the costs are substantially higher than what the CBO's projecting right now.
Well, I differ with you on that in the following sense, Dave. I don't think, I mean, I wasn't involved in 2017. I don't think if you talk to Paul Ryan or any of the other people that were the architects of that, including obviously President Trump, I don't think they thought that they were going to raise taxes in 2024. I think that they thought that that was the compromise they had to make, and that it would be hugely, and wasn't as good as making those tax cuts permanent, but it was the deal that they had to make to get that tax bill in place. And you've just done something which I think people do all the time, and I think it's not the right way to talk about this, which is you put the spending problem and taxes in the same category. By that I mean, we can debate whether our tax system is progressive enough. I would argue it's extraordinarily progressive when 10% of the taxpayers pay 78% of the taxes and 40% don't pay any taxes at all. But we can debate whether that's progressive enough or not. But what's certainly the case is that tax cuts are putting money in the pockets of consumers. It's putting money in the pockets of businesses that can then reinvest that money into capital and job creation. And that's a related but separate issue from the fact that the spending has spiraled out of control. And to put this in perspective, under the 4 years of the Biden administration, and this is, I agree with you, this is a bipartisan, the spending problem is a bipartisan challenge. It's happened under Republicans and Democrats, but we added $5 trillion to the debt. And if you look at the pre-COVID versus post-COVID, discretionary spending went up by 63% just in that 5-year period, because a lot of the COVID spending has remained intact. So we're starting to tackle that with this bill, which is the reconciliation, which deals with largely entitlements and tax policy. And then in 2026 appropriations, we're going to get a chance to deal with the discretionary spending. But I don't think it's fair to say that our costs. The problem is that we're putting money back in the hands of consumers or giving them a permanent relief on taxes is the same as the fact that our costs have gone up by, an outrageous amount.
We may be putting it back in the pockets of consumers, but we're certainly not putting it into the treasury at the same time we're increasing spending. There are some spending cuts in this one big beautiful bill, but they don't come close to making up for the shortfalls on revenue. That's certainly according to the CBO scoring, and I think most economists have looked at it. So how is this really turning around the fiscal situation to get us back toward a more affordable world? I mean, your old boss and friend Ray Dalio has written a book about how countries go broke, and is analyzing exactly this. I mean, it may not be tomorrow, it may not be next month, but if we keep going this way in the long run, I think we may go broke. Do you agree?
Well, I think you and I agree that the debt is a problem we have to deal with. Our deficit spending, we have to deal with it. I personally would look back in time over the history and the effectiveness of the CBO scoring on revenue, and I don't think you'd find a track record that you and I would want to bet on, including in the 2017 tax cuts. So I think we start with the basic view, and this is what's been true since I was a young man following Ronald Reagan, that pro-growth economic policies, growing the economy, lowering taxes, putting money in the hands of consumers, making it easier for businesses. Those are the key steps for a growing economy. We need to grow the economy. If the economy is at 3% or 4%, that's a much different fiscal outlook for us than if the economy is at 1.5% or 2%. So pro-growth economic policies are critical. But then, yeah, we got to bend the cost curve, and I think you're right. This is a step in that direction, but it's not an adequate step in that direction, and we're going to have to do more. But let me just frame the dilemma of that for you, David. Just to, in this House bill, there's something like $600-700 billion of Medicaid cuts, which is the way that they're being portrayed. And for the business people in this room, here's the reality of it. The reality of it is that what's in the House plan essentially takes the growth of Medicaid, the fastest growing program in the last 5 years. It's grown by $250 billion in annual spending. It's been double-digit growth over the last 5 years. It takes that and it slows the rate of growth. So all that you're reading about in Medicaid is slowing the rate of growth from 5% to 3%, and it's doing so that's not cutting, that's not reducing, that's reducing the rate of growth. And then it's doing so by essentially taking people out of the program, not the people that are the vulnerable people that are supposed to be the beneficiaries of Medicaid, not the disabled, not the children, not the women with dependents, but working age men who are dependent, who have no dependents, or illegal immigrants who were never thought to be beneficiaries of the program by the very definition that they're illegally in this country. So that's the dilemma. So if you start to do the kinds of things you need to do to get things on track, this is the pressure you see. So I'm proud of what the House came out with, which I think it was a good step in the right direction. I think in the Senate, we'll try to make it better. But the totality of this is one that's great for our economy. It's great for working people. It delivers on President Trump's promises, and that's what I expect will happen. We'll get a bill that both sides can agree on, both the House and the Senate, and hopefully turn it into law.
Senator, let me ask you about something you know terribly well, and that's the bond market. Because if everything you say is true, why doesn't the bond market believe it? We've not seen that reaction, particularly in the long bond yield. The bond market right now is looking at this saying, we don't think they are getting their arms around deficit, unless you disagree with me. Do you agree that that's what the bond market's saying?
Well, listen, I'm not gonna get into the squiggles on the bond market, but I'd say the following. I think the scenario that's playing out is what most people that follow this process carefully expected to play out. And as I said, I think we can make this better, and I think we're going to pass the bill. But I also think that people honestly are a little bit too focused solely on the big beautiful bill, because I want to step back and say, here's the world that I see. Right? If you think about the U.S. economy as like a big ship, and you've got different dials that you're able to dial on the ship, here's what's coming. Here's the certainty. There's uncertainty about the tariffs to some degree. I'll come back to that in a minute. There's certainty, I believe, that we're going to have the biggest deregulatory push since 1981 when President Reagan came into office. There's a huge focus on deregulation, which is critical. It's the #1 issue I heard from small businesses or big businesses in Pennsylvania. The second thing we're going to have is energy dominance, which is going to lower energy prices, help make manufacturing in the United States much cheaper. It's a critical piece, being a net energy exporter to the economy that we need for the future. I think there's a lot of certainty that we're on the path to that. I think there's a lot of certainty that we're going to have huge foreign direct investment in the United States. We already see that. President Trump's trip overseas was huge, and the commitments that people made. I followed in his footsteps and went to the UAE. They publicly committed to $1.4 trillion of capital in the United States over the next 10 years. There's equal commitments in other places. So we have enormous foreign direct investment in Pittsburgh just last week, this Nippon deal, which is $28 billion of new foreign direct investment, a key driver of the economy. And I think investors should look at the big, beautiful bill as a high probability, which gives certainty to what's going on. The tariffs, I think, will ultimately result in a fair trading regime, but there's definitely uncertainty associated with that. And I hope we can spend a minute talking about that, David, because I'm stepping in for Jameson to some degree. I don't speak for the administration, but I can certainly give some perspective on that. So those are that's the wind at the back of the economy, which I think people should have confidence in. And listen, the debt problem and the deficit spending is something we have to deal with. And this bill is a step in the right direction. But you and I both agree it's not enough.
So just before we turn to tariffs and uncertainty, because we certainly want to talk about that, just one last thing on the big, beautiful bill, at least related to it. We talk a lot about government efficiency. Efficiency usually is getting the same result for less money. It's not eliminating programs. What we've seen in part in some of the cuts coming out of the administration and proposed as well in the bill are just shutting things down. And let me give you one example, not shutting it down, but substantially cutting NIH funding. Now, okay, you can argue whether it's being well spent or badly spent, but that's not making it more efficient unless there's something going on I'm not aware of.
Well, a couple things. I think you're talking about the 2026 budget, not the reconciliation. I don't think the NIH funding is.
Yeah, no, I was exactly.
Yeah. So we're early in that process, but let me tell you my views on NIH. So I don't speak for the administration on this. I haven't looked closely at what the administration's proposed, although I know it's some reduction in spending. My belief is that we need to be. This is a moment of competition for innovation around the world. That basic research should be something that we increase, not decrease, is a general proposition. Whether it's DARPA, defense spending, NSF, and other places, because we've got to win the innovation arms race, and we're at a period where the pace of innovation is growing. So that's my starting point on it. And as it relates to NIH, what happened recently was the administration came out and proposed capping indirect cost at 15%. And the reason they did that, and Bob and I have talked about this, I'm sure there's some in the room that'll disagree with what I'm about to say, but what happens with NIH indirect costs is they are very varied by institution. And so in some places you have a 60 or 70% indirect cost, in some places you have 40 or 50. And my perspective on this is that, and in some cases, the NIH funding has been used to fund things that certainly had an ideologically charged agenda. So what the administration was proposing was to cap existing grants at 15%. I didn't think that made sense. I called Secretary Kennedy, and the reason is it was too disruptive. It disrupted life-saving research. It was too abrupt. We lose key scientists. So my view on this is that we should continue with the current grants, which is currently what's happening due to a pending court case, but go back to a process which really scrutinizes how NIH grants are given and whether they're appropriate and how they're funded from an indirect cost perspective. It seems to me there should be a common methodology for thinking about indirect cost and making sure the taxpayers are not underwriting things that don't make sense. The second point I want to make on this is, and this is a bit controversial, but I also think that some of these NIH grants go to our biggest, best endowed universities, Yale with a $50 billion endowment, or Harvard. And my view on that, putting aside all the ongoing questions about anti-Semitism and funding, where I think they should be held accountable for that, but in particular, the reason they have these enormous endowments is because we, the taxpayers, have given them a special advantage. I had university president come in the other day and say, you know, why are you going to penalize our great success and performance? I said, wait a second. You had compounded tax-exempt returns for the last 30 years. That's why your endowment's as big as it is. And with that comes an obligation to underwrite the public good. And so I have a view that for those who have been the biggest beneficiaries of taxpayer benefits, they should also probably be the most generous in helping to underwrite that NIH research, maybe some sort of sliding scale. But I agree with you that NIH funding and basic research funding in general is a critical part of the future. And as a senator from Pennsylvania, we're highly dependent on this. I'll be a strong voice for that point of view.
So, Senator, I've held you back too long from tariffs because I know you want to get to this. But
no, I'm not dying to get to tariffs, but I'm certainly happy to.
But as I see it and talk to various business people, there are two issues with tariffs. One is what's the level of tariffs. The other is the uncertainty around tariffs. Talk about the uncertainty part. When can we expect some form of quietude after what we've seen?
Well, it's so interesting how you start that question, David, because I think the entire conversation, I credit President Trump for this to a large degree, the entire conversation, I think, has shifted where a lot of people now start with the premise that reciprocity and fairness is a good starting point. In other words, we should have fair trading relationships with Europe, the European Union, with Canada, with Mexico, with China. So it's not okay for us to have open markets, no barriers, no tariffs, no trade non-tariff barriers, and for other countries to have all these things which make it hard for U.S. businesses to sell or so forth. That's where I think the conversation has shifted, and we're now talking about the execution. So I just want to pause on that to make sure that I at least land the point that I'm someone who has tried to negotiate, been part of negotiating free trade agreements. And I believe that where we are today is not an acceptable position. So after World War II, we gave open markets to Europe and Japan as a way to help those economies build back. That was fantastically smart. It was leading the world. With China, we struck a deal, which turned out to be a bad deal. We brought them into the World Trade Organization, gave them preferred access to U.S. markets. And they didn't live up to their deal. They stole intellectual property. They have non-tariff barriers. They have tariffs. And so we're sitting in a position where America hasn't had, for lots of reasons, some intentional, some unintentional, we don't have a fair trading system. And what President Trump campaigned on, and what I campaigned on is like, listen, let's use reciprocal tariffs as a mechanism to try to level the playing field. And what that means to me, and I don't speak for others, what that means to me is if there's non-tariff barriers or subsidies or tariffs in another country, then we use tariffs thoughtfully with reciprocity to try to level the playing field. And if the other side would lower all those non-tariff barriers and be totally open, then we would want to lower and be open. So it's a way to get fairness. That's the goal of it. And when President Trump rolled that out, he rolled out a system where you had the 10% base and then the different tariffs by country. And across Pennsylvania, what that meant was a lot of CEOs were saying, I don't know how to respond to this. I don't know how to invest capital. I don't know where to move the supply chain. It takes 2 years to bring it back. You know, how do I respond? And it created the uncertainty you mentioned, and President Trump acknowledged that uncertainty. Here's where I think we are today. I talked to Jameson yesterday on his way out of town, and he said that there's 10 to 15 deals stacked up, which they expect to move on very quickly. My advice is, listen, I'm talking to CEOs all the time. They need a roadmap. They need clarity for what these deals are going to look like. We need to squeeze the uncertainty out of the system. If people are negotiating in good faith, I hope, again, I'm speaking for myself, that they'll kick the deadline, the 90-day deadline, down the road, as long as people are negotiating in good faith. I think it's possible that we may start to treat countries with free trade agreements with a different rubric than those that don't have free trade agreements. But I think that in the coming weeks, you'll see more certainty come into the picture. And I'm optimistic when the dust settles, we're going to have fairer trading relationships than we currently have, which it also should be great for the U.S. economy and great for U.S. businesses. But I don't disagree with you that it's created some uncertainty.
But you lump together, at least in that answer, the various countries we trade with. There are a lot of countries, and there's a range of fairness or unfairness among them. In his first term, President Trump really focused all of us on China to agree that we had not been before. And I think many people give him credit for that, saying we had been asleep at the switch, as it were, with China. Did it make sense to go after everybody as opposed to really focusing in on China, which is such a major, it's the second largest economy, it's a major issue for many Americans, of course, for national security reasons as well as economic?
Well, we certainly agree China is the biggest offender and China is the biggest challenge. So we're going to have to try to do two things at the same time. We're going to have to try to enhance and greatly improve the nature of those businesses, our business relationships, our trade relationship with China, but recognize that China is the tough nut, and we're probably, they're going to be very difficult to negotiate with. So we're going to have to probably keep tariffs in place to ensure the level of fairness, and to some degree we're going to decouple from China, particularly in key areas, and I think we should, that are most critical to our national security, most critical to our economy. So the ongoing relationship with China is going to be a very challenging one, and we should be less dependent on China. And unless China does a dramatic turnaround in terms of the fairness of the way it deals with the United States, I think our relationship with them is going to evolve over time. Listen, that was a strategy that President Trump undertook to go out all at the same time. It's playing out in a variety of ways. If we get the deals that I'm told are being negotiated in Asia, that's going to give us enormous leverage against China. So I think there's a lot of strategic rationale for that. But I don't subscribe to this logic of, well, how could you do that to your friends? How could you do that to Europe or Canada? The way I describe this, I was just with a bunch of German CEOs the other day, and there's a little bit of the, how could you do this to your good friend Germany? And I said, listen, this is like a marriage. One partner in the marriage is basically saying, listen, it's not fair. This is out of balance. It may have started in a certain way, but now it's at a position where this is not an acceptable ongoing status quo. So we have to change the balance. And we're in the process of changing that balance. Doesn't mean we're going to get divorced. It doesn't mean we don't share common values, common interest. But the only way to get that balance back is to go in with sort of a hard-nosed view of this is unacceptable. In order to preserve the marriage and in order to continue to have that great relationship, we need to make some changes. I think that's what's happening. And I do think that the president's strategy is treating countries differently depending on the level of barriers, the level of subsidies. There's a different tariff proposal depending on the country, and ultimately, I think the president's shown a lot of agility and ability to sort of change that if we're making progress. That's what I hope we'll continue to see.
Senator, I'm mindful that you're a senator from Pennsylvania, which has more than a passing connection with energy, and you're on the Energy Committee in the Senate. Tell us about the Amazon announcement just yesterday, which caused quite a bit of attention.
Yeah, it was a very exciting day. It was a big announcement 6 miles from where I grew up in northeastern Pennsylvania. I grew up in Bloomsburg. This was in Berwick, which was a neighboring high school. And it was an announcement of a $20 billion investment over the next couple years in multiple data center campuses across Pennsylvania. And this really fit into and if you'd asked me when I graduated from high school, 40 years ago, would I ever be standing there announcing $20 billion, the biggest investment in Pennsylvania history, 3 times bigger than any other investment. And it fits a narrative that I've been saying since I started to run for office, which is Pennsylvania should be ground zero, in my opinion, and I think the market's starting to see this, in the intersection of energy innovation and artificial intelligence. We have the 4th largest natural gas reserves in the world, 2nd largest energy producer in the United States. We have nuclear, we have abundant natural gas, coal, solar, wind, so a lot of energy. We have an incredible skilled workforce. And when you start to talk to the hyperscalers and talk about their goals, speed to build is key in this thing. It's not whether you get some $25 million subsidy from the state on a $20 billion project, is can you get shovels in the ground and get this thing up and running. So our skilled workforce is a real asset. We have enormous water reserves, which is key. We have proximity to within 500 miles, 65% of the population, and we have these world-class universities, Carnegie Mellon, Penn State, which can create technical talent. So that's the reason it's so attractive. This Amazon deal is, I think, one of what I hope will be many that'll follow. And it comes on the heels of the Nippon announcement with Nippon and U.S. Steel partnering and Nippon making a $28 billion investment or $14 billion investment rather in new investment in Pennsylvania and other states. So the goal here is to make sure that those assets are the assets of Pennsylvania are widely known to big investors. I was in the Middle East describing this to big investors around the world, is to make sure we stay focused on delivering on the opportunity there. And then what's unique about it, I guess because it's Pennsylvania, but hopefully because of the way we're trying to conduct ourselves, is this isn't a traditional Republican coalition. This is pro-business people. This is the labor trade, the trade unions. This is the environmental. I mean, this is opportunity for everybody. It brings together people across parties, local, federal, and the Amazon deal was a good reflection of that.
That's exactly where I wanted to go. I guess, reluctant to try to find bipartisanship these days in Washington, but is there potential bipartisanship when it comes to all of energy? Because when you went through the various sources of energy, it was not one against the other. It was not oil versus gas versus coal versus solar versus nuclear. And nuclear very much now is in the mix. Is there a possibility for Democrats and Republicans to get together on what some people on the Democratic side are calling the abundance agenda? To basically take care of some of the permitting restrictions that certainly have had on nuclear and really come together on growing.
Well, I'm not sure I'm not sure what is in the abundance agenda, so I don't want to associate myself with the abundance agenda. But I do think there's an opportunity. I do think there's an opportunity for bipartisanship in general. So in my state, I have forged a great relationship with Senator Fetterman. He and I have introduced a number of bills together, and I think we'll continue to work closely together. I've built a good relationship with the governor. Getting these huge projects in requires a partnership between federal and state, and this is an area I think we can agree on. I mean, I think the 24 election, frankly, was a clarion call. I think one of the reasons Kamala Harris and Bob Casey lost in Pennsylvania was because of their position on energy, and it was the no fracking under any circumstances, which evolved into a less enthusiastic ban of fracking to something pro-fracking. And I don't think anybody ever really believed that they meant what they said. And I also think that there was a lot of criticism, which I was one of those making the criticism, that even if you're supportive of an all-in strategy, which I am, I'm happy to have wind or solar, whatever it is, as long as it's market-based. And the idea that you're going to create, trillions of dollars of spending, which is going to drive inflation, one of the root causes of inflation under the Biden administration, 21% increase in prices, which with real wages lagging, was because of this spending. So I think you're seeing the pendulum swing, and I hope what we'll see with President Trump is changing the EPA standards. But also, at least for me, I will be someone who welcomes all forms of energy in Pennsylvania. They create great jobs. And even in the big, beautiful bill, the House zeroed out a lot of those tax credits. The position I've taken is that those were starting to stimulate some good activity. So consistent with my campaign pledge, I want to phase those out, but I want to do it in a little more of a reasonable way, which doesn't lose the momentum we have in the capital expenditures and the job creations associated with it. So I do think this is an area of possible agreement. And listen, I come at this as a Republican who views himself as an environmentalist, a conservationist, and someone who believes climate change is a real thing and man-made carbon contributes to it. But the best way to address that problem, in my opinion, is by developing and exploiting natural gas, which is key to Pennsylvania, and exporting that around the world to replace coal-fired plants in China and India. And so I think there's a set of policies and points that hopefully we can build a bipartisan consensus around.
Senator, you have a remarkable and varied resume, but it starts, at least as a young adult, at West Point. I mean, you're one of a handful, I believe, of people who graduated from West Point, went on to serve in the United States Senate. And then you actually wore the uniform and you've been in combat. So you have a particular position, a viewpoint, I should say, on geopolitics. Let's talk about that for a moment and where we are right now, because there are a lot of geopolitical hotspots. Start with Ukraine.
Well, I'm the ninth senator from West Point, and I don't want to get too too emotional or hand wavy here, but I do want to say, when you walk through the halls of the Senate, when people say, must be horrible down there, it's so polarized and so forth, you walk through the halls and you see these statues of Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant and George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and you realize, our country's gone through all these chapters, lots of them strife-filled, and the people that made a difference and led us through that are as critical today as they were then. So, I'm not putting myself in that category. I'm just saying I feel a responsibility and a privilege to really be able to do this. And one of the things that I've always talked about, as someone who was in the military and served in the Middle East in Iraq, is the importance of American leadership in the world. And if you look at the situation with Ukraine, I think we have a situation where Russia was the clear aggressor, and we're in this point where we've got to find an end to the fighting and the killing, which has killed millions of folks and created an enormous tragedy on both sides. And so the idea that we'll have a ceasefire, kind of consistent with what's happened in the past. Unfortunately, I don't think Ukraine's going to claw back Crimea or any of those things. This is more like a North Korea, South Korea kind of armistice, I hope. And the idea that the Europeans, which is President Trump's plan, that the Europeans should step up and provide the security agreement, step up and spend much more in defense than they have. Ever since I worked for President Bush 20 years ago, we've been trying to get the Europeans to do 2%, and they never did. Now they're starting to do that because I think they're getting so much pressure to do so. They should provide the security agreement. That security agreement to Ukraine is so critical because it guarantees them that 2 years later, Russia's not going to, rearm itself and come back in and take away its sovereignty. And I think the economic deal that President Trump had proposed and I think's in place, which gives us joint economic interests in rare earth metals and so forth, is smart because it also has a payback to the American people for what they've invested. But more than that, it creates alignment and is a deterrent to Russia. So I think the outline of that deal that President Trump has put forward is good, given the circumstances. I support that. And now the question is whether Russia is going to do what it needs to do, and I think Ukraine's there and is willing to do a deal. And will Russia do a deal? I've signed on to a sanctions package in the Senate, which I think will help President Trump to apply more pressure. We'll see if that goes forward, but that's where I think things stand, and I'm not sure how it's going to be resolved. But Putin's a tough character, and I sat in rooms with him a couple times in the past, and he's only going to respond if he feels the pressure, and I think that's what we need to put on him. So that's the big one. I just got back from the Middle East. Dina and I went there. We visited the Emirates. We visited Israel. I'd say the second big thing is probably worth commenting on is Iran, and obviously that is a great geopolitical risk if Iran gets a nuclear weapon. With the explicit goal of its government to state the destruction of Israel and the destruction of the great Satan. That's not good. That's not okay. So I support what President Trump has said, which is we have to have complete dismantlement, no enrichment. The negotiations are underway. We'll see if we can get to a deal that does that. I think we should be very dubious and skeptical of the Iranians. And ultimately, if they're not going to dismantle their nuclear program, then we're going to have to get rid of it. And I hope that can be avoided. But that's the pressure point. I don't think a nuclear Iran is acceptable. And I think it's a moment where Iran is at a weak point. Israel has greatly dismantled its missile capability, although it's still potent. Hezbollah's been very damaged by the attacks in Lebanon. Hamas has been very damaged. So they're in a moment of relative weakness. I think we need to, strangle them further on their ability to export oil. That was a mistake of the Biden administration, in my opinion, to allow that to China and put the pressure on. Final thing I'll say is China. China is the true rival to America as a global superpower. It's something where I think we need to recognize it is a true adversary. I think we need to decouple in areas that are critical to our national security, whether it's semiconductors or pharmaceuticals. I think we need to hold China accountable for bad behavior. As an example, exporting the fentanyl precursors to Mexico, which then comes across the border and kills Americans. But we also have to recognize China is the second most powerful country in the world, and we're going to have to coexist. I think we need to do that with strength. I think we need to rearm our military. What happened in Ukraine with these $500 drones destroying a huge part of the Russian Air Force should be a wake-up call to all of us that asymmetric warfare poses a huge challenge to traditional force structure. So in the course of reforming our military, I think we need to make sure that we see that asymmetric threat, which is why I'm such a supporter of further investment in our military.
So let's talk about that specifically. You wrote a book, actually, as I recall, about cutting back on the Army in 1998. But we do have a different world that we've seen with those $300, $700 drones. There's an effort underway at the Pentagon with the new Secretary of the Army. I think they call it transformation of the U.S. Army. What do you think about that? And perhaps most important, is it doable? Because you get a lot of resistance. Already I read just today that one member of Congress is saying, wait a second, you can't cut back on that strategic office because that would really undermine what we're doing. Can we really reform what we're doing, what we're spending money on, and how we're spending it at the Pentagon?
Well, we certainly can, and we must. It's always been hard to reform the military because the military is prone to fight the last war and sometimes fail to see over the horizon into the next war. So it requires there's got to be a creative tension. And the most successful defense reforms have been the result of that tension. But if you step back and say, what are the basic ingredients of a lethal force, a force that can defend America's interests around the world? You got to have great people. You got to have incredible people. So I think the fact that we've got an uptick in our recruiting, a merit-based process for promoting the warfighting generals is a critical piece of it. It's a personnel process that gets the best talent in the right spots. I think that's key. I think there's good news on that front, but there's a lot to do. The second thing is you got to have an innovation culture, a culture where failure is okay. The thing I wrote about in that book, I guess 25, 30 years ago was the idea of a zero defect culture. It cuts against innovation. You got to have fail to learn and then grow. That's how we all get better, learning organizations. So the culture has to get a mix up, and I think there's efforts to do that. And then we got to we create competition among next generation companies for defense technology. And we've got this procurement process that makes it very difficult for new companies to break in, AI companies, drone companies, the kinds of lethality and the kinds of next generation asymmetric warfare. So we've got to have procurement reform. That's the thing that has really stood in the way. You've got these big defense contractors that are really critical to some of those base load capabilities, but they're not on the forefront of innovation. And so we got to break open the procurement process, make it a lot easier to try things and fail, but also make it a lot easier to get new companies in the mix. We had a big, huge consolidation in our defense industry, and it's time to open that back up because some of the biggest innovations are not going to come from the big three or the big five. It's going to come from companies you've never heard of.
In your answer, which was comprehensive, you named 4 or 5 constituencies who would rather not have reform. Starting with the big defense contractors, all the lobbyists involved, some people I suspect in the Pentagon who are used to the way it's worked, but people like Capitol Hill who are used to the way it works, they like it just over there. How can you possibly cut through it? When was the last time we had fundamental reform at the Pentagon?
Well, I didn't say it was going to be easy. It's going to be easy. I said it was necessary. It comes to leadership. I mean, without casting aspersions at past leaders, I think we have not had leadership that has demanded change. So I'm not suggesting it's easy. I am suggesting that the pace of everything's changing. So if we go back to our AI energy conversation, if there's 5 or 6 big hyperscalers, my proposition to you would be in the next 5 to 6 years, there's going to be 3. It's moving that fast. We see this with real life combat underway in Israel, Gaza, Iran, Ukraine, Russia. The very nature of war is changing in ways that we might never imagine. Drones are so. I think there's a recognition that artificial intelligence, in particular, and autonomy is bringing all sorts of new risk to our military forces. And so I think there's definitely a call to change. And the question is whether we're going to have military leaders and civilian leaders that have the agility and the vision to be able to make that change. And I think that's what President Trump is shooting for. And I think there's some big changes afoot. So we'll see. But that's what the way I would test whether we're on track is whether the pace of change is adequate for the moment, and it's going to have to pick up at a pretty dramatic pace. But again, when you see that, the front page of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, I guess a week ago, where a huge part of the Air Force of Russia was destroyed by a series of $500 drones, that's certainly a wake-up call for anyone who's a military planner, that the nature of warfare has changed, and we need to change accordingly.
One point sort of ripped from the headlines today is the deployment of National Guard and apparently Marines as well in Los Angeles. I don't think I'm going to ask you, unless you want to talk about it, whether that should have been done, whether it was under the statutes or not. But as a former Army officer who commanded troops, are our troops trained to handle that situation? What are the challenges if you're going into an urban domestic situation and there are disturbances? Because it sounds really hard to me.
Yeah, well, it's a hard mission, and the president has only chosen to do that a handful of times in recent history, and in this case, the decision was made to protect federal facilities and federal workers from the violence and the rioting that we saw on the streets. So I'm supportive of the action, but I share your concerns. Whenever you're putting soldiers into harm's way, and you have protesters or rioters that are throwing Molotov cocktails and blowing up cars and are violent, it poses a risk. But if you don't respond with authority and sort of bring law and order to the situation, then I think you're really at risk of losing control of the situation, which is exactly what happened in Minneapolis and Portland and other places, post George Floyd. So I'm sure I haven't been part of the discussion, obviously, but I'm sure the president took all that into consideration. But if you do the counter narrative, I don't believe that the governor in California or the mayor had it under control. I don't think there's any evidence to believe that. And if you do believe that that federal workers are at risk and federal facilities are at risk, then I think the president had an obligation to secure it. And it's a tough mission. There's training for it, but it's always tough when you have soldiers put in harm's way, and this is a situation which is particularly difficult for that reason.
Senator, I always truly enjoy talking to you and learning from you. I have one last question, and it's a blatant opportunity to plug your book. You and Dina.
We accept all blatant opportunities to plug our book.
A terrific book that I recommend to everybody on mentoring. But let me ask you, you're a relatively new senator. I don't typically think of senators as being mentors, but can you find people around there that have a little more experience than you do that you can actually learn from?
Yeah, there's a great tradition in the Senate of it's historically been a very hierarchical institution. If you read Master of the Senate from Lyndon Johnson, things like that, but I think it's becoming less so in some ways because each senator can be kind of an independent voice on their own, and the committees have a lot of power, but there's also the ability to influence the debate with your own voice and so forth. My approach to this has been, be the guy who listens a lot and talks a little, and pulls the guys that have been around for a while, the men or women that have been around a while, and seeks their counsel and seeks their advice. And you see, it's like looking at, if there's 53 Republican senators, it's like looking at 53 little businesses. Each one of them conducts their business differently, is more focused on certain things, legislation versus, leadership in a certain category. And I'm trying to look at those role models and ask myself, what kind of senator do I want to be? I have an opportunity for the next 5.5 years to represent Pennsylvania, and you have time and energy as a discrete resource. So how do you use that in a way that's most effective? So next time we talk, I think I'll give you a couple examples of senators that I've seen either in the present or the past that are the kind of senators I'm hoping to become. But it's a great opportunity and a great privilege, and there's lots of good role models.
Thank you so much.
Great. Well, listen, thank to you both. It was a great conversation, and we kind of had to improvise a couple of different times. So thanks to the team of the Economic Club who organized all of this. They do it all the time. Sometimes it's not as complicated as it's been the last few days, but all of us in the club are appreciative. David McCormick, Senator McCormick, thank you very much.
Bob.
You did a great job, and we covered a lot of territory, and we have to thank our travel guide for that, and that was David Westin, who took us through all the different territories and did a great job. So everyone in the room, enjoy lunch. Those on video, thank you for your time. You can see on the program, we have a couple of more programs before we get into the meat of the summer and take a bit of a break. So everyone, thanks for being here. Senator McCormick, Dave Westin, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.